Had a chance to catch up with Dr. Don Levy. Don is the director of the Siena College Research Institute. Essentially, he's the head of the public opinion polling at Siena College in New York. Don oversaw the research that went into what has been a bombshell poll that was released 1 year ahead of the 2024 presidential election. And it showed that Donald Trump leads President Joe Biden in 5 of 6 key swing states that Biden carried in 2020. Not surprisingly, the poll has sent shockwaves through the political world. There was one particular question that really struck me as unusual in the poll. And indeed, Don told me it was the first time his team had ever asked this question in a political poll. He said it was a variation of an old concept talked about by Ronald Reagan back in the 80s. This was a little bit of a shorter conversation than I usually do on this podcast. After this poll dropped, Don has been in high demand. Everybody wants a piece of him, and I'm glad I got some of his time because he shared a lot of interesting insight. So here he is, director of the Siena College Research Institute, Don Levy. Get started on one thing, which is the poll's reputation. 538, I know, has given the Siena College poll an A rating. So that's run by 538 is run by Nate Silver. And so that really means you guys have had quite a bit of predictive success, at least in recent history, if not more so. And I think they based that rating on 21 days out, right? Accuracy of 21 days out from an election. Yeah.
So yeah, we've done very well. We've been working with the New York Times on a significant amount of polling since 2016. In the 222 cycle, we actually were named in that analysis, the 538 analysis, as the most accurate pollster in America.
Wow.
I think a little bit about our methodology. We sort of pioneered what's become far more used by a lot of people now. When we first broke into doing the pre-election polling, we started using lists of registered voters. And at that time, the gold standard was to do random digit dialing. And in fact, some people were still asking questions about how likely you are to vote. And if you indicated that you weren't very likely, they just cut you out of the poll. Our belief from the beginning was that anybody who is registered to vote has a greater than zero probability of voting, and they ought to be included in the poll. So what we do is we take your history of voting on the voter list, and we compute a probability that you're going to turn out to vote in this election. We then ask you if you're going to vote. We combine those two into a single score, and we apply that score as a weight, the same way that we weight by gender, by education, by income, by party, if you register in a party in a state. So, that was a method that we built over the years. And, I think a lot of people have come over to using that now. We also, fortunately, have the funding to do really rigorous quotas. So when we do a state like Michigan, I was just talking to some people in Michigan, we will break Michigan up into 6 regions. Within each region, we'll have quotas of people by race, by age, by education. So our quota screens for a single state, we could have as many as 50 different individual quotas that we seek to fill to cut down on the threat to error that can leak in. Because obviously, if you think about it, we can have the appropriate number of people who are white, non-college educated men. But if we get a skewed sample, it can affect us. We guard against that by having so many quotas, rather than some people would just say, we'll do a statewide sample, and we'll try to clean it up by waiting after the fact. We try to minimize the waits by having these rigorous quotas, and it's turned out to be really successful in the vast majority of our polling.
So it sounds like a much more granular approach. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Michigan, at least. Yeah.
Yeah. Certainly more granular, and just we're trying to get as cleanly representative sample as we possibly can through the voices of the respondents, not by getting anybody you can get and then weighting them after the fact. It's less expensive to weight them after the fact because there are many times where you look at our quota screens And there are some folks who are more likely to respond to a pollster than others. And, we go hard to get those others that are more difficult. There was in 2020, there was some folks who had trouble getting the most ardent Trump voter to respond to them, and that tended to show up in the geographies that were most predominantly for Trump. So we will oversample those areas to seek to guard against that threat.
Got it. That's interesting. I want to ask you a little bit more about that later. But before we do, just one thing, if you could explain how the scoring works that you just mentioned, when you measure how likely someone says they are to vote versus their voting record of at least showing up at the polls. Well, how do you issue a score? Is it on like a 1 to 10 scale? What's that look like?
Well, it's a probability score, so it's from 0 to 100. No one's ever a 0. No one's ever 100. It's based on their vote history. There's a couple other ingredients in their vote history, relative to their demographic. So if, for example, you are a white man under the age of 50 with a college education, we look at your vote history relative to other people that fit into that category. And so we'll weight you up or down depending on whether you tend to turn out more or less than other people who are in your demographic. So we compute one score off the knowledge that we have on the voter list. Then we get you on the phone and we ask you a series of questions about how likely it is that you're going to vote, how much attention have you been paying, do you know where your polling place is, a series of questions like that we then compute into a score. It's a 0 to 16 score. We turn that into a probability, and then we merge those two scores using the voter list data for 65%, 35% for what you state. And that's based on going back after the fact and testing to see how predictive our score was of whether you did or didn't vote. So we do after the election work too, that's kind of invisible to everybody, where we go back and see if the folks that we deem to be a 90% probability to vote, to what extent did they vote? To what extent did the people that we deem to be a 25% probability to vote, to what extent did they vote? So we're constantly kind of tweaking our model. That's how we ended up with this 65-35, because we found the information on the voter list actually to be more predictive than what you tell me on the phone. And so we build that into one score, and they range from just greater than 0 to nearly 100%. And then we apply that as a weight the same way that we weight by, do we have the appropriate number of white registered Republicans under the age of 50, et cetera, et cetera. So, that's something that, we kind of pioneered in partnership with the Times. And, now as we presented that at various conferences and people have, seen our methodology, more and more people have gone to a version of that.
It's fascinating that much goes into it. And even after the fact too, like you said, once everything's over, going back and checking. So what caught my eye about this poll, which is kind of a bombshell poll, it's been all over, making headlines everywhere, is one particular question. And I'll read that question. It was, do you think Joe Biden's or Donald Trump's policies have helped you personally or hurt you personally? And that just struck me. I was like, I don't know that I've ever seen a question like that in these polls. Obviously, I don't read them all, but I do read into them sometimes. And so I was wondering, is that a question that you've used before in a poll? And also, if not, why not? Why start with this poll?
It's a new question. The history on it is a couple fold. In one respect, it goes all the way back to the famous Ronald Reagan quote, where during his campaign, he said,
"Next Tuesday is election day. Next Tuesday, all of you will go to the polls, will stand there in the polling place and make a decision. I think when you make that decision, it might be well if you would ask yourself, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? Is it easier for you to go and buy things in the stores than it was 4 years ago? Is there more or less unemployment in the country than there was 4 years ago? Is America as respected throughout the world as it was? Do you feel that our security is as safe, that we're as strong as we were 4 years ago?
Are you better off or worse off today than you were 4 years ago? And you combine that with the anecdotal information that we get from our polls and our follow-up interviews, because we'll go back and we'll do qualitative interviews with some respondents where people will say things to us, and they have been saying things to us like, Donald Trump may, he may not be the type of guy that I personally like. I don't approve of everything that he's said or done, but I like his policies. So that we kept hearing that again and again. So you combine this attempt to get at, are you better off or worse off, with this idea that voters have a view as to whether the policies of a sitting or former president actually help them in their lives or hurt them, that they make a political, economic calculation as to whether, when it's all said and done, is that person in the White House who's leading the country, is it making your life better or making your life worse? Now, that said, I think maybe, and my conversation on these two questions is, they're different. They seem at first blush to be balanced because we ask the same question for Trump and Biden, but they're different because one of them is president now. Right. And so, right now, your perception of whether Joe Biden's policies are helping or hurting you is colored by, your experience in the political marketplace, your experience in the economy. And Donald Trump was president now. It's getting closer to 3.5 years ago. So it's not as fresh in the voter's mind as to whether those policies helped or hurt. Still, we felt it was a fair question, and we were really struck by the mirror image responses that we received, where you've got a small majority saying that Trump's policies helped rather than hurt, a small majority saying that Biden's policies have hurt rather than helped.
So I'll mention the numbers. I'm curious too, though, like who came up with that question, and you gave the insight into it, but was it your question or does your team come up with that? Like, just take me through the process of that. Do you kind of like pitch questions and?
Yeah, we do. I mean, we have an iterative process. We work on you're probably familiar, and your listeners are familiar with the Google Docs. And we'll open up a Google Doc, and we'll pull out recent surveys, and we have a library of questions that are in there, and each member of our team and the team over at the Times will start adding and commenting within that Google Doc, pitching individual questions, and we'll argue back and forth over wording and order, and are we going to include this question or not? So that particular question was that. Many of the questions that we ask are ones that we've asked before, so we're looking at trend lines. So there's a sort of a core skeleton on the poll almost before we start. But a new question like that, fights its way in. Sometimes the new questions are just, we'll ask, who do you trust more on the following issues? So an issue can drop off, a new issue can come in. But it's an iterative process, and I can't really, I'd have to go back through the Google Doc to see whose notes were there. I don't think I can take credit for that question personally, but we kicked it back and forth for a while.
Was there any resistance to including a new question, any new question, or especially this new question? Because this just really struck me as new. I was like, obviously I don't read all these, but I've never heard a question phrased just like that before.
Yeah, there's always some concern and trepidation. We'll test it. We'll do as many as 200 interviews with people in states that we're not going to include in the poll to see how the questions are received by respondents. Does it make sense? Do they hear it the way that we think it's heard? I think at this point we're happy with that. I always, when I've been talking to people in interviews, I do try to point out that it's indeed different to talk about, there is a selective romanticization sometimes of memory. But clearly what this that two question sequence showed us is that right now you add in right track, wrong direction, we add in the state of the economy, that it's another measure of the relative difference between how the voters in these battleground states are perceiving the effect of a Biden administration versus the effect of a Trump administration on they themselves. And hurt you personally, we were aiming for more of an economic sense, although it was sufficiently open that it could bring in societal issues as well. Now, as you know, we asked that question, and we've asked that for a number of polls. When you are preparing to make your decision as to who to vote for, and then we rotate the order, do you make your decision more on economic issues like taxes, cost of living, inflation, or do you make your decision based on societal issues like abortion, guns, and democracy? So we that question was actually asked prior to the hurt helped question. So we were trying to activate people to think about both societal issues and economic issues when that helped or hurt you personally was left unstated as to whether it was economic or societal. Because someone who had an issue with Roe v. Wade being overturned could say that Trump's policies hurt me because of the change there. But it does feel from the results of the poll that we are in the battleground states right now a dissatisfied nation. The high rate of feeling as though the country's headed in the wrong direction, the really abysmal numbers on perception of the quality of the economy right now, and then the negative view towards both Biden and Trump, but most especially Biden when it comes to the issue of age and mental acuity, resulted in Trump leading now in 5 of 6 states that Biden carried closely in 2020.
Right. And those 6 states are Georgia, Nevada, Michigan, Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. I'm sorry, those are the 6 states. Biden's still leading in Wisconsin slightly.
Correct. Still has a 2 to 3 point lead in Wisconsin. I think that you're looking at really 2 types of states. The northern states are, tend to be grouped together, although they're not entirely similar. Pennsylvania and Michigan a little bit more similar to one another than is Wisconsin. Wisconsin, not as diverse a state as Pennsylvania and Michigan. Georgia has really become the bellwether of American politics. I mean, there has been so much concentration on Georgia in 2020. In the runoffs there, and now with the trial there, so Georgia is a hotbed. And interestingly, I mean, we haven't had a chance to touch on it yet. Despite the fact that we show Trump with a meaningful advantage in Georgia, about 7 points, that when we turn the question around and we say, if indeed Trump is convicted of a crime, how's that going to affect your vote? And there we see actually Georgia flipping, and enough voters who say they're going to vote for Trump, if indeed he's convicted, are going to move their vote. And Biden actually, according to this poll, would carry Georgia. In fact, he would carry all 6 of the states, according to the poll, if indeed Trump is convicted and it has the impact on voters that they now say it would have.
That's an interesting angle to all of this too. Just the trial, and even if it happens, I mean, have they settled on a trial date yet for the federal election interference case?
I think they have a date. I wouldn't call it settled, right, because of the amount of motions that are being filed, and clearly. It's in, from our poll, it would be an advantage to Donald Trump to postpone. to not have those trials. And certainly, there's so much going on. Everybody says, well, do you think your polls are predictive? You may have gone back and looked at polls that we did in 2019, a year before the 2020 election. And at that point, Joe Biden he hadn't locked up the Democratic nomination. So in that poll, we were testing Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders against Donald Trump. But yet, our polls were highly predictive at that point in time. I think this situation is a little bit different. I think that it's such a volatile political landscape right now that while I feel as though our polls are an accurate snapshot as of today, I think there's an awful lot that's going to take place between now and when people start casting their votes.
Yeah, and that's 1 year away. And just to get back to the new question, just so I can get the responses mentioned, it was 53% responded that Biden's policies hurt them personally, while 36% said the same of Trump's policies, and 36% responded that Biden's policies have helped them personally, while 51% said the same of Trump's policies. I'm wondering, and it sounds like you might be able to do this. I'm wondering if you could speculate on how these numbers would play out in less swingy states, for instance. And it seems like you may have a little bit of insight into that because you said you tested this question in some states that weren't going to be involved in the poll. Is there anything you can share on that?
Yeah, I mean, it's anecdotal because, we don't have the same level of precision, the same numbers, but we saw similar numbers when we tested it in states that either were bright red or bright blue. So, in a poll that we just did in New York in October, immediately prior to launching these battleground polls, we found, and we track New York all the time because that's where we live, that New York obviously is a blue state. No one has much belief that a Republican would carry New York in a presidential race. But the margin we have seen erode in New York of a Biden victory over Trump. And to some degree, we didn't ask that particular question across the whole sample, but there are issues that are eroding some of Biden's support, even in a deep blue state like New York, including the influx of migrants and the effect that's had here in New York State in general and New York City in specific.
Got it. Interesting. One other thing I was struck by, something you said in the press release announcing the poll. You said if the 2024 matchup featured a Democrat other than Biden running against Trump, the generic Democrat would be ahead by 7 to 12 points in 5 of the states and ahead by 3 points in Nevada. What does this mean in terms of how should the Democratic Party take this poll? It almost sounds to me like this poll might be a warning signal to get another candidate ASAP.
Well, I think it is. I think that you also have to realize that a generic Republican does better than Trump does.
True. Yeah.
So, we have 2 candidates, both of whom have warts. The Democrats are only concerned really about the warts that their candidate has. They like the warts that the opposition candidate has. It's often true that when you ask voters, do you want to reelect a sitting governor, a sitting senator, a sitting president, or would you prefer someone else? That someone else does better than any named candidate. That said, it's an enormous swing, from Biden losing by an average of 4 across states to an unnamed Democrat winning by an average of 8. It's a 12-point swing.
Yeah.
That's a monumental swing. So, it says that the Biden candidacy has challenges. The issue of his age, the perception of him not being as mentally sharp as voters would like, the erosion of support amongst young voters, the erosion of support to some degree amongst Black and Latino voters, all of whom have been consistent constituencies that favor Democrats over Republicans all have to take, the Democrats have to take notice of that. I don't sit in their war rooms, and certainly, despite the fact that any number of different pundits have written and spoken over the past couple of days about maybe it's time for the Democrats to take another look. That would be a surprise if Joe Biden said, "Oh, I saw the Times Siena poll. I guess I shouldn't run." I doubt that's going to be the impact. Well, however, I think they've got to take a look at what the poll was saying. Bidenomics has not percolated. I know that they say they feel as though over the next 12 months, Americans will come to realize that the economy is improving, that Biden's policies, in other words, are helping them, not hurting them. And they think that will, as well as they're pointing out what they perceive to be Trump's weaknesses, will carry the day. But I think right now, I don't think they're necessarily surprised by our polling. I would think that they have good people working for them who are doing internal polling, and they know that they have weaknesses. So they have to realize that. The Republicans as well. I mean, the fact that a generic Republican beats Biden across the battleground by 14 points. 14 points. Yeah. We even saw Nikki Haley doing better than Trump in virtually every state. And another thing that I'll throw into you is when we put RFK in a poll.
So this is what I want to ask you about. Yeah.
And we said, okay, let's, what happens if you have a three-way? Robert F. Kennedy, who I would be surprised if 24% of Americans have actually ever heard RFK make a speech. Yet, in these battleground states, nearly a quarter of voters are saying that given the choice in a three-way, that's the direction they would go. And in fact, of voters under the age of 45, it's almost dead even between the three.
Yeah. So under 45, it's RFK at 32%, Biden at 30%, Trump at 29%. And I looked into the numbers as you go down in the 18 to 29 demo, it's even more support for RFK, right. 34% for RFK, which beats Biden and Trump by 4 and 5 points respectively. That's fascinating. What do you attribute that to?
Well, I think that young people are especially dissatisfied with both these candidates and with the leadership. They're looking for a more optimistic, new approach to politics, and two guys that are circa 80 years old just is not the answer as far as they're concerned. They don't feel as though either of these candidates are speaking to them. They may or may not be thoroughly engaged in the political process. They also are not necessarily hemmed in by this, it's got to be a Democrat versus a Republican. You can't have a third party candidate. At this point, a year out, they're saying, why not? Why not someone else? Why not with someone who doesn't necessarily fit into either of those two camps? And they don't want to hear about, you can't get on the ballot and fundraising. They're just saying, there's got to be a better answer. And given the opportunity, they accept Robert Kennedy as that sort of vessel to put their dissatisfaction into.
Were you surprised by his strong showing in this poll? And have you also, are you surprised too by how dismissive the Biden campaign and basically the Democratic Party in general has been of Kennedy? Up until this point, they really don't even mention him, and they denied him Secret Service protection, and they've basically forced him out of the out of the party.
No, I'm really not surprised, because I see the level of dissatisfaction, and they're operating sort of from a different paradigm, right? They're operating from this conventional paradigm that has two parties, that's headed towards these conventions, that's talking about being on the ballot and having these, party apparatuses in each and every state. And so they're dismissive. They say, well, he can't possibly be a real candidate. He's just a protest candidate, and he's not real. But right now, we're not putting him on the ballot in every state. we're giving people, and if you looked at some of the after interviews that were published, a few of them were published in the Times today, where people said, yeah, I guess I would vote for Biden, or I'd vote for Trump in a head-to-head. But if Robert Kennedy was on the ballot, I'm going that way, because neither of these two major candidates really address what I'm looking for. I think that both campaigns have to take that seriously and have to find a way to address those concerns. I mean, enthusiasm is going to be, we haven't had a chance to talk about that, but you can poll as much as you want to poll, and you can predict based on what respondents are telling you. But this is an election that in many ways is going to ultimately be decided by small groups of relatively disengaged voters in 6 states. The hardcore is going to show up for Biden or for Trump. One of the measures that we have is we do the favorable, unfavorable, and you look at the group of people who have an unfavorable view of both of the two major candidates. And that's approximately now 20% of the electorate. So 1 out of 5 voters, those voters tend to be the ones who vote with the least regularity. They follow the issues less closely, but they're going to vote, and they're going to make their decision on some combination of their personal perception of the candidates, where they stand on the issues that are most salient to them. And right now, that group of people is saying, I wish there was another option. I wish there was a generic D, a generic R, or hey, you offer me RFK. That sounds pretty good to me. And to discount the fact that those voters are going to make the decision, they don't believe that. They believe that the key is not the unfave voter. They believe the key is to generate more enthusiasm or more need to vote amongst their hardcore, their insiders, to get that enthusiasm up. You got to do that, but you have to address the less engaged voter. And right now, that voter is speaking loudly and clearly that they don't like these two options.
Yeah, and that they do like RFK. One last thing here, real quick. Do you think that any of RFK's strong showing in this poll can be explained by his stance on the Ukraine war? I know you guys, your team has done some polling on that. I think the latest was in August. He's been really against that war for a long time. I actually had him on this podcast back in May, and he was rather prescient in his overall assessment of the counteroffensive and how that would play out.
It is not in our interest. It's not in the interest of Ukraine. Their economy is in ruins. Their infrastructure is in ruins, and they're probably never going to have a coherent country now.
If you were to become president, how would you disentangle the U.S. from this war? Like, how could it be done?
I will settle the war. I will have a ceasefire my first day in office.
How are you going to do that, though? Like, are you going to tell Ukraine we're cutting off?
Ukraine, we need a ceasefire, and I don't think there'll be any argument. Ukraine is going to China asking them to settle the war.
I know, I saw that.
Yeah, okay, well, that's because they don't, they know what we're up to. We want the war, and he doesn't have any options now. They have lost the war. Russia has won, and then the spring offensive comes. It's going to be a nightmare. So, all of what they said was going to be the offensive, it's stalled. This is a catastrophe, and it is the direct fault of the neocons in the White House, who seem to be running the White House, rather than the president.
You would call for a ceasefire immediately, but even if you were to become president, you wouldn't be sworn in until like roughly 19 months from now. What do you think is going to happen in between now and then?
I'm terrified about what's going to happen between now and then. I'm terrified because they don't, the neocons seem to be okay with World War III.
Do you think that's fueling that in any way?
I don't have any evidence that would point that one way or another. I'll take a look at that. I'll sort of cross-tab that question by RFK support. So I really can't answer that one intelligently. I think that my perception is that voters are relatively unfamiliar with him. they have a glancing familiarity with him. And he's young, certainly young when you compare him
Younger, yeah.
younger. He looks young compared to the other two.
Yes, he does.
And he is anti-establishment to a certain extent. They get that. They get that maybe they agree with him on one thing, they don't agree with him on something else. He's just not, within the orthodoxy, and they like that. Whether it's on one issue, whether it's vaccines, Ukraine, or it was interesting to note. My first query was, oh, is it older folks like me who are in love with the Kennedy mystique, who remember his father?
Sure.
And as it turns out, his support amongst voters 65 and older, that was his weakest area. So it doesn't speak to the Kennedy mystique.
Yeah, it is interesting. It's that 18 to 29 demo that's at 34% for him right now. And then I guess that also brings up the question of how reliable are those voters. You guys have the score on how reliable.
They're not the most reliable voter.
Right.
They're not.
Right.
But in these swing states that get decided by a couple of points, they will make a difference. Hey, I gotta go, and I appreciate it. And don't be a stranger. I'm happy to speak. Anytime you want to.
Absolutely. Let's try to do it again sometime. But thank you for taking the time today. It's fascinating to talk to you, and congratulations on the poll. And it's making a lot of news, which is good to see. And I think giving a lot of valuable insight for people around the country. So,
all right. Thanks very much, Andrew. You have a great day.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
You too.